The cabin of the luxury first-class flight was a world of its own, a floating palace of comfort and exclusivity. Plush leather seats reclined effortlessly, and the soft golden glow of the ambient lighting set the perfect mood for a peaceful journey. A gentle hum of classical music played in the background, blending seamlessly with the delicate clinking of fine crystal glasses as the attendants poured champagne for their elite passengers. Seated near the front was James Carter, a self-made entrepreneur, or so he loved to claim. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, a Rolex peeking from under his cuff, and a presence that exuded entitlement, James considered himself the epitome of success. To him, first class was more than just luxury. It was a badge of honor, a silent declaration of power. As he scrolled through his phone, a subtle frown creased his brow. Across the aisle, sitting with an air of complete nonchalance, was a man who didn't fit the first-class mold. He wore a simple black t-shirt and jeans, his tousled hair giving him an almost disheveled appearance. No designer brands, no extravagant accessories, just a man who seemed oddly comfortable. James scoffed, nudging the well-dressed woman beside him. "Look at that guy," he murmured with a smirk. "Probably a lucky lottery winner or some influencer who got a sponsorship deal. First class isn't what it used to be." The woman chuckled politely but averted her gaze, sensing James's need to flaunt his status. James, however, wasn't done. His voice, just loud enough to be heard, carried an unmistakable arrogance. "I mean, seriously. No suit, no watch, no presence. You can tell who belongs here and who doesn't." A few heads turned, some passengers subtly glancing at the man in black. But the target of James's ridicule remained unfazed, scrolling through his phone as if the world around him didn't exist. James smirked, mistaking the silence for submission. What he didn't realize was that in mere moments his words would come back to haunt him in a way he'd never forget. The aircraft hummed steadily as the flight attendants made their final rounds before takeoff. The scent of expensive cologne, mixed with the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee, creating an air of sophistication that James had grown accustomed to. He tapped his manicured fingers against his champagne flute, glancing around to ensure that his earlier comment had been acknowledged by his fellow first-class passengers. He lived for validation, and nothing pleased him more than feeling superior. Across the aisle, the man in the black t-shirt remained absorbed in his phone. He hadn't even flinched at James's words. The audacity. James narrowed his eyes, unwilling to let the moment pass. A flight attendant, a woman with sleek blonde hair and a flawless uniform, approached the man with a warm smile. "Mr. Musk, would you like your usual drink before takeoff?" James froze mid-sip. "Mr. Musk?" The attendant's words seemed to echo in his head. The man in black barely looked up, offering only a polite nod. "Just water, please," the attendant responded with a respectful nod before hurrying off. James's heart pounded. No, it couldn't be. His mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe this was some other Musk. But deep down, an unsettling realization crept in. That face. He had seen it before, just not like this. Not in jeans and a t-shirt, but in headlines, at tech conferences, on the covers of business magazines. James swallowed hard. He had just openly mocked Elon Musk, the billionaire genius, the man responsible for revolutionizing space travel, electric vehicles, and AI. Beads of sweat formed at James's temple as his confidence wavered. Passengers around him were now exchanging knowing glances. They had recognized Musk from the start, but they had also heard James's arrogance. They were waiting to see how this would unfold. James shifted in his seat, his throat suddenly dry. He had just insulted one of the most powerful men on the planet, and the flight had barely even begun. A thick silence settled in first class, one that James suddenly found suffocating. He adjusted his tie, his fingers brushing against the expensive silk as if grounding himself in material wealth would somehow restore his dwindling confidence. He needed to act natural. Maybe Musk hadn't heard him. Maybe the passengers would forget about his arrogance. But then he noticed something. A smirk. Elon Musk hadn't looked up from his phone, hadn't reacted outright, but there it was, a subtle curve of his lips, a knowing glint in his eyes reflected on the dark screen of his phone. James felt his stomach drop. Then, as if fate itself conspired against him, the flight attendant returned. "Mr. Musk, would you like to confirm your in-flight meal selection?" she asked politely. James barely heard Musk's casual response. His mind was racing. He had just belittled the Elon Musk, the man whose name alone carried more weight than James's entire portfolio. Desperate to regain control of the moment, James let out a forced chuckle. "Oh," he said, voice just a little too high. "I didn't realize who you were." Musk finally looked up, his piercing blue eyes locking onto James's. He raised an eyebrow, the smirk deepening. "Oh," James swallowed. "I mean you're dressed so casually. You threw me off." Musk tilted his head, amused. "And that bothers you?" The passengers were now fully invested in the exchange, heads subtly turning, pretending not to listen, when they were, in fact, hanging on every word. James forced another chuckle. No, of course not. I just, well, first class, you know. I thought—" He trailed off, realizing how foolish he sounded. Musk let the silence linger just long enough for James to squirm. Then, with an air of complete nonchalance, he leaned back in his seat. "Interesting," he mused, returning to his phone. James exhaled sharply, unsure if that was the end of the conversation or just the beginning of his humiliation. He wasn't used to feeling small, but for the first time in a long time he wasn't the biggest presence in the room, and everyone knew it. James's heart pounded as the realization settled in. He had mocked Elon Musk, the very man who could buy and sell his entire existence without a second thought. He swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the weight of the moment, but it got worse. A voice came from behind him, smooth, composed, and laced with amusement. "Well, James, you were saying something about how first class isn't what it used to be." James turned his head slowly, as if in a nightmare where every motion dragged on for eternity. Behind him, a distinguished gentleman with salt-and-pepper hair smiled knowingly. Richard Branson, the billionaire founder of Virgin Galactic, another icon of innovation, another powerhouse who had overheard everything. A murmur swept through the cabin. Other passengers, executives, CEOs, high-net-worth individuals were now fully invested in the spectacle. Some smirked behind their champagne flutes. Others exchanged glances, intrigued by James's inevitable downfall. James stammered, his once polished demeanor crumbling. I didn't mean." Elon Musk, who had remained silent all this time, finally looked up. His piercing gaze met James's, but there was no anger, just something infinitely worse, indifference. He leaned back in his seat, his voice calm. "Don't worry, I get underestimated a lot." The statement wasn't defensive, it wasn't even directed at James alone. It was a universal truth, and yet James felt exposed. He forced a nervous chuckle, trying to salvage his pride. "Mr. Musk, I didn't recognize you. I was just making casual conversation." Musk arched an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching as if he were barely holding back amusement. "Casual conversation, huh?" He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I'm curious, James, what do you do?" James hesitated. He suddenly hated that question. I run a startup." Musk tilted his head. "What kind?" James felt the heat rising in his neck. His company wasn't exactly SpaceX or Tesla. A marketing firm, digital branding, Musk nodded thoughtfully. Ah, marketing. He let the word hang in the air for a moment before adding, "So you sell perception?" James forced another laugh. I wouldn't put it that way." Musk's expression didn't change. "But I would." Silence. James felt the weight of his own words collapsing in on him. Everything he had said, every snide remark, every judgmental glance, it had all been built on perception, and now, in the presence of men who had shaped the world, he felt small, insignificant. Then, to his absolute horror, Musk turned to the flight attendant. "Hey, Sarah," he said casually. "Mind if we switch seats?" Sarah blinked. "Of course, Mr. Musk." Musk grabbed his water and stood, stepping over to the empty seat beside James. He sank into it comfortably. James's breath hitched. Every first-class passenger was now fully engaged. Musk took a sip of his water, then exhaled. "So," he said, turning toward James, "let's talk about success." James swallowed. The real lesson was about to begin. James sat stiffly, feeling like he was trapped in a high-stakes boardroom meeting where he was the least important person in the room. Elon Musk, now seated comfortably beside him, swirled his water in its glass, his expression unreadable. The entire first-class cabin had gone silent, passengers pretending to mind their own business, but hanging on to every word. James cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. I didn't mean any disrespect earlier. Just some casual banter, you know." Musk glanced at him, his face calm but his eyes sharp. "Casual banter." He repeated the words slowly, as if weighing them. "Funny how that works. It's always casual until the target turns out to be someone important." James felt his stomach twist. Musk leaned back. "I remember a time when people told me I didn't belong in certain rooms." He took a sip of his water. "When I first started Tesla, I was laughed at, told it was a doomed idea, that no one would ever buy electric cars. When I tried to create SpaceX, people in the aerospace industry called me a fraud." He smirked. Slightly. "Now NASA buys rockets from me." A ripple of knowing chuckles spread through the cabin. James swallowed hard. Musk turned to him fully now, his voice smooth but firm. "You said earlier that you can tell who belongs here and who doesn't. Let me ask you something, James." He tilted his head. "What do you think success looks like?" James's mind raced for a response, but every answer he had sounded ridiculous. Expensive suits, Rolex watches, flashy displays of wealth? Musk continued. "You see, real success doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't need validation from strangers in first class. And it sure as hell doesn't judge people based on appearances." James opened his mouth, but no words came out. Musk gestured around the cabin. "Half the people here? They didn't get where they are because they looked the part. They got here because they built something, because they took risks, because they worked their asses off." James lowered his gaze. Musk studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Listen, I don't hold grudges, but you should know. How you treat people. When you think they're beneath you says more about you than it does about them." Silence. James felt something shift inside him. He had spent his entire life trying to project an image of power, yet in this moment, sitting beside a man who had changed the world, he had never felt smaller. Musk finished his water and stood up. "Anyway, I should get back to my seat." He gave James a small nod. "Have a good flight." And with that he walked back across the aisle, sinking into his seat with effortless ease. James exhaled shakily, feeling the weight of every eye in the cabin. He had been humbled, not through anger, not through confrontation, but through wisdom. He stared down at his untouched champagne. It suddenly didn't taste like success anymore. James sat frozen in his seat, Musk's words reverberating in his mind like echoes in an empty hall. How you treat people when you think they're beneath you says more about you than it does about them. It wasn't just a passing comment. It was a revelation, a mirror held up to James, reflecting a truth he had never dared to acknowledge. For years he had built his identity around status, around the illusion of power. He had prided himself on dressing the part, speaking the part, playing the part of a man who belonged in first class. Yet, in the span of a single conversation, Elon Musk had shattered that illusion. Success wasn't about the watch on his wrist, the tailored suit or the expensive champagne. It was about substance, about what a person built, contributed and stood for. James slowly placed his glass down on the tray table, the once coveted luxury now feeling hollow. The flight continued smoothly, but James no longer cared about being seen, about projecting wealth. Instead, he found himself watching Musk. Despite being one of the most powerful men in the world, the billionaire showed no arrogance, no entitlement, no need for validation. He sat with effortless ease, replying to emails, occasionally glancing out the window as if contemplating something far beyond what anyone else could comprehend. And the most humbling part? He had let James off easy. If Musk had wanted to, he could have destroyed him with a single tweet, could have turned James into the latest viral laughingstock, mocked by millions for his arrogance. But he hadn't. Instead, he had given James something, far worse than public humiliation. He had given him the truth. James shifted in his seat, something heavy pressing on his chest. A part of him wanted to pretend this never happened, to brush it off as just another bad encounter. But another part of him, the part that still had a flicker of self-awareness, knew this was a turning point. He could ignore it and stay the same, or he could let it change him. Taking a deep breath, he reached for his phone. His hands hesitated over his social media apps. For the first time, he had no desire to scroll for validation, no desire to compare, to boast, to prove anything. Instead, he opened his notes app and typed a simple sentence. Success is built, not worn. For the first time in years, he felt like he was finally starting to understand. As the plane descended, the skyline of New York glittered below like scattered diamonds against the dark velvet of the night. Passengers stirred, gathering their belongings, conversations picking up once more. James remained seated, staring at the screen in front of him, but not really seeing it. His mind was elsewhere, still replaying Musk's words, still feeling the weight of his own reflection staring back at him. Elon Musk stood up effortlessly, grabbing nothing but a sleek, unbranded backpack. No designer luggage, no entourage. Just a man who had nothing to prove. As he walked past, he paused briefly, glancing at James with a knowing smirk. Maybe next time you'll judge a little slower, he said, his voice calm but firm. James swallowed, nodding stiffly. For the first time he had nothing to say, and for the first time he realized maybe that was a good thing,